So back to my story. Sulochana published his Guru Business book in 1986. So I'm going to step back a little bit because I'm telling my personal story and I've got a little bit off tangent here, going off into his story. And actually the whole part of that Sulochana isn't really related to my personal story per se, but I felt it was warranted to include it here for the historical perspective. The incident that I had with Rajendranath, where he informed me that the GBC had banned Srila Prabhupada's letters, that took place in the summer of 1984. I'm going to back up even a little bit more before then, because in the later part of 1983 or 1984, I had a meeting with Bhavananda, and he wanted me to produce a multimedia show, an exhibit for the New York Brooklyn Temple. We're going to turn the whole downstairs, and I don't know if the bingo parlor next door, but the whole downstairs into a multimedia restaurant, where he had ideas. My idea, though, when he asked me to do a presentation there, I wrote a script, and I entitled the show ISKCON Around the World. And the idea of this show was to showcase all of the ISKCON temples and the achievements of ISKCON worldwide as a means to lead up to glorifying Srila Prabhupada. The main feature was to glorify Srila Prabhupada by glorifying the mission that he is, the festivals, the Ratha Yatras, the temples, and all over the world. And Bhavananda rejected the idea. He told me he was not going to glorify the temples of Bhagawan and Harikesh in his New York temple. Instead, he wound up asking one of his disciples to write a script about how one of his disciples had taken shelter of him, Bhavananda. And he wound up rejecting the idea of glorifying Srila Prabhupada, and he wanted and showing Srila Prabhupada as the center of his mission. He wanted only to glorify himself, with himself in the center of his zone. I had no interest in making any such show. And some months later, Bhavananda was removed as a guru and a GBC due to his homosexual relations with other men. Then in the summer of 1984, in summer of 1984, I came to LA and I found out that Prabhupada's letters had been banned. About 6 months later, on January 1st or 2nd, 1985, I had a most disturbing experience with Rameshwar. I met Rameshwar. I was meeting with Rameshwar about the future of the Fate Museum project. In that meeting, Rameshwar started to give me the same arguments that Bhavananda had given to me earlier. He told me that because Rameshwar was telling me because he was going to be spending his BBT money, his exact words were my BBT money, instead of saying it was Prabhupada's BBT money. He was saying, if I'm going to be spending my BBT money, then he said he wanted to make sure that all of the exhibits and audiovisual presentations that were now to be produced by the Fate Project, he said that they could only ever be used in his zone. So his idea was that to do this, he told me that all future exhibits, all future shows had to contain something about him or about his temples and his zones, such that none of the museums could ever be used by any other temple or zone. This was the disease these men had. They were no longer seeing ISKCON as being Srila Prabhupada's mission. And they now saw everything as belonging to them. They didn't want Prabhupada in the center. They wanted themselves to be glorified in the center of their zones. They didn't see the temples any longer as Prabhupada's temples. They were now their temples. Rameshwar no longer called the BBT money, the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust money, as Prabhupada's money, as Bhaktivedanta's money, but he called it his money. My money, he said. If I'm going to be spending my BBT money. I told Rameshwar, at the beginning, I just was speaking nicely. I told him this was wrong. I quoted him I was quoting from a letter that Prabhupada had written around 1976, and he wrote the letter to the Fate Museum devotees. Fate is what we called the multimedia museum project that was my service. So he wrote the letter to the Fate Museum devotees, Prabhupada did, and that he wanted us to make these museums in each and every one of his, Srila Prabhupada's centers worldwide. I told Rameshwar that my mission was to carry out Srila Prabhupada's instructions. Therefore, I told him that the Fate Museum project, according to Prabhupada's instructions, was to produce shows for all of Prabhupada's centers. And I reminded him that the BBT money was not his money, that it was Srila Prabhupada's money. And therefore, it was to be engaged in Srila Prabhupada's service for the benefit of all of his temples and his ISKCON mission. Rameshwar snapped back and he said, "Those letters and Srila Prabhupada's instructions are nearly 10 years old. Those letters are outdated. They're no longer relevant to ISKCON." Oh, I remember those words because they were just like swords going into me. I remember those words. Rameshwar was saying that those letters are outdated. Prabhupada's letters, because it was almost 10 years then, were outdated and they were no longer relevant to ISKCON. Rameshwar told me, "Ami, you're just like the others who are still stuck living in the past, trying to only follow Srila Prabhupada. In case you haven't noticed, Srila Prabhupada is gone. He's dead. He's no longer living. There are now new acharyas, and your duty is to now surrender to one of us and follow our instructions." Those words pierced my heart like a sword. How arrogant, how fallen, and how offensive. Srila Prabhupada said that what made him successful in establishing Krishna consciousness in the West was because he never gave up his desire to fulfill the instructions of his Guru Maharaj. Yet, this illustrious GBC man was telling me that I was stuck living in the past by still trying to follow my dead guru's outdated, no longer relevant instructions. Instead, I had to surrender to Rameshwar or one of the other new gurus and only follow their instructions and not my dead guru's instructions. Prabhupada had died only in Rameshwar's heart. In my heart, he was still very much alive. The instructions and teachings of the spiritual master are eternal. They live within the heart of his surrendered followers. Sadly, Srila Prabhupada was no longer living in Rameshwar's heart at that time, and he wanted him dead in my heart as well. We were both sitting on the floor. Rameshwar was behind his low desk. Actually, this took place in his room at the Laguna Beach Temple because it was at the end of the Christmas marathon. At the end of the Christmas marathon, they have a festival. They had, anyway, at those times, at the Laguna Beach Temple. And so I jumped up to my feet. I was standing over him, and I just unleashed a torrent of words of rebuke. Until then, I had been trying to submissively accept the leadership of the GBC. But I personally refer to this as my Bali Maharaj moment. This was the turning point for me when Bali Maharaj's guru instructed him not to surrender to Vamandev because Vamandev was actually Lord Vishnu who had come to trick Bali Maharaj. At that point, Bali had no choice but to reject his guru. He saw his guru was giving him all bad advice. In the same way, I had been trying to follow the GBC, their leadership, but when my GBC instructed me to no longer follow Srila Prabhupada's instructions and to consider that Srila Prabhupada was no longer living in my heart through his instructions, and his instructions were no longer relevant to his mission, I had no choice but to flatly and totally reject the so-called authority of my GBC. I was standing over Rameshwar, at that point, and I told him that it was he and all the other GBC men who think like you. I said, you are destroying Srila Prabhupada's mission. I told him he had fallen down so much and was so much in Maya that he couldn't even see how offensive and wrong his words were. I told him he was not at all fit or qualified to hold the position of a spiritual master. Again, this took place upstairs in his room at the Laguna Beach Temple during their annual, celebration held at the end of the Christmas Marathon. And as I recall, everyone in the room was Rameshwar's disciple, at least as far as I knew, except for myself and Agni Dev Prabhu, who was then the temple president of Laguna Beach. As soon as I had completed my say, I noticed Agni Dev back up to the door, reach with his hand behind him, and he opened the door and he just slid out the room, leaving me with just Rameshwar and his disciples. I don't know why Agni Dev did that. I have never asked him yet. Actually, I haven't seen him for many years. But after speaking my piece, I thought for sure that Rameshwar's disciples were behind us, would drag me out and beat me. I didn't care. I had to speak up. No one, I had to speak up, but no one moved. Rameshwar sat for a few seconds, then he sat up straight. And with great indignation, he began brushing off his arms as if there were water droplets on them, while saying, "You are rocking my boat, and you have splashed water all over me." If it were any other circumstance, I would have been rolling on the ground laughing, thinking that he was trying to be funny. His comedic delivery, his words, even his looks reminded me exactly that of Jack Benny. For all the younger devotees, Jack Benny was a stand-up comedian from the 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s who had his own show on TV. And as a child, I used to watch the reruns of his shows. If this had been a comedy sketch, Rameshwar delivered his lines with the perfect timing, the pauses and the deadpanning that became the trademark of Jack Benny. But sadly, neither of us were trying to be funny. We were both dead serious. He said, "Ami Atma, there is no longer a place in ISKCON for people like you who won't give up trying to live in the past. It's time for you to make like a pebble dropping into the material pond and bloop." Again, an explanation for those who may not be familiar with this analogy. In the early days, when a devotee left ISKCON, we used to say that devotee had blooped. A Back to Godhead magazine article written in 1991 by Jayadvaita Maharaj states that in 1966, Srila Prabhupada once said that one who gives up Krishna consciousness falls again into this material pool. Srila Prabhupada imitated the sound of a stone falling into the water. Bloop. And that was it. Bloop became a standard devotee lingo. To leave Krishna consciousness was to bloop. Rameshwar reenacted that analogy, telling me to make like the pebble, dropping into the material pond and bloop.